Hello, everybody. I'm Eli Lake of the New York Sun, and I'm here today with the blogger behind Intel Dump, a national security lawyer and a former Army captain. Phil Carter, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Eli.
All right, so we were going to start off. There was a big story in the New York Times yesterday about former high-ranking American military officers getting kind of briefings on the Iraq War in 2005, 2006, then going on cable network news shows and giving what the article at least sort of says is a spin. What are your thoughts on that? I know you blogged about this and you've had some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think this is probably nothing unusual. The idea that you would give access in exchange for favorable coverage is something that happens every day in Washington. What I found problematic here, though, was the sort of unusually cozy relationship between these generals and the Pentagon, these retired generals in the Pentagon, and the political appointees in the Pentagon and the White House. So it seems like this is yet another indicator of the kind of Republicanization of the military officer corps. I think that's been a problem really since the end of the Vietnam War.
Well, that's an interesting thought. I did not expect that. Do you think that might have to do with the fact that the Democratic Party in its tent at least includes people who seek to diminish the overall military budget and have in the past at least sort of tended to go with sort of the first versions of stories, portraying American military and the American soldier as a masochist and other sorts of nasty things?
Well, I wouldn't agree with that characterization of everyone on the left, but I certainly think that...
No, I'm not saying... I'm saying within the tent of the Democratic Party, within the tent. Yeah. Within that tent.
Sure, it's a big tent, and within that tent there are some folks that feel that way. I also think this is, the echo of 40 years ago. This is the echo of the anti-war movement in Vietnam, and the way that is playing out now is that the Democratic Party, for better or worse, and the left, for better or worse, is still viewed by many within the military with hostility, and the right is sort of viewed as the ideological compadres. And this played out during the Reagan administration and the Bush first administration and during the Clinton administration as well, with Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the Somalia debacle and then the fight over whether to go into Bosnia. And now that we're in the Iraq War, I think we're seeing a lot of twists on this because the military is increasingly disenchanted with the Bush administration. But, at the very senior ranks, we're still talking about a lot of people that are in bed with the Republican Party and in bed with the administration. And I think that, I read this article with a bit of dismay to see the ties that run through the Fox News network and the party and these political appointees' offices and these retired generals.
Well, it's interesting. Can I ask you a question, Phil?
Go for it.
Do you think that the Democratic Party's efforts to sort of make it, to bring into its fold veterans and soldiers as one of its constituencies is as futile as the Republicans' 30-year effort to try to persuade African Americans to vote for the GOP?
No, I just think that both parties need to do a better job. Look, the demographics of the military should be a democratic demographic. We're talking about the enlisted ranks and the junior officer ranks. These are very diverse groups of people. They're young. They are working class and middle class. It's fair game for both parties. I think what's at issue in this article, though, are a different group of people. These are the career...
Yeah, these are the elite
military
generals,
officers, right. This is the military caste, and this is a group that's isolated and insulated from the rest of society, and it's really sort of its own segment of American society today as a consequence of the all-volunteer force.
I think so. And I think, by the way, that if you wanted to sort of pinpoint the real sin of this whole story, it's the fact that these retired officers, as apparently also senior Bush administration officials, were getting total bunk briefings when the war was really going awful, and in particular, what might be called Iraqification, or the strategy of trying to devolve authority to security forces that were not only not ready, but were also very much infiltrated by sectarian militias that caused so much bloodshed and so much misery in Iraq, that the failure to sort of identify that early on and then to speak of the war in 05 and 06 as going swimmingly when it clearly wasn't, that's really a problem, and it pervaded, I think, the Bush administration and these retired officers.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not a problem to do propaganda, but it's a problem when you believe your own propaganda and then make strategy based on that. and that's exactly what was going on here. And it's a bit appalling that here are these generals. They're supposed to be our strategic best and brightest, and they're falling hook, line, and sinker for this stuff. That's just not good.
Yeah. Yes, but I think that to a certain extent, there's a certain allure to feeling that you are getting kind of more privileged information. I would imagine we both at different points have gotten background briefings where you sort of feel that you're getting sort of better stuff. But it's a really important lesson that I think everybody right and left who works in any way in the media that covers national security, even when you're getting what you think is privileged information, and you have to consistently and always force yourself to check it through as many sources as you can.
Right, and that's also the story that's buried in here. It's one about the media and how the media was asleep at the switch. I mean, I blame CNN and the other networks for not doing enough due diligence here and not really pushing their pundits to apply that extra layer of skepticism. That's a problem, and there's all these interlocking ties with businesses that have contracts with the Pentagon. There's probably a need to have some disclosure here, too.
Well, I mean, I'm always for disclosure, though I would say that CNN and I think MSNBC and other networks have had plenty of sort of credible voices that have been very skeptical of the war. And indeed, I mean, we've seen, I think in some cases you might find that, when finally after, a significant change in strategy in 2007, there's been a reluctance to accept any kind of, positive trends. I agree with you that people should be vetted and there should be full disclosure. I mean, these are all important things, for kind of keeping everybody honest and also informing viewers what point of view people are saying. But at the same time, I don't think that the American people have been starving for Iraq skeptics.
No, certainly not.
No, at least not recently. Now, and then the other thing is, I chafe every time. And this guy Greg Mitchell just wrote some book about the media really dropped the ball before the Iraq War. Whereas, I mean, I'm saying, sure, it would have been great to have figured out that the stockpiles that the Bush administration said were in Iraq weren't there. But if you'd covered that story as I had for a while before there was even talk of invading Iraq, then you could go and you could find the last two weapons inspectors before Hans Blix would tell you that he did have these stockpiles and that the point was that Saddam was sort of out of compliance and that there was every reason and lots of credible experts who weren't partisan and officials from both sides of the aisle who really believed basically that Saddam was amassing this sort of apocalyptic arsenal. So sometimes the argument about the media doesn't get it is really I think that's a little bit off as well.
Yeah, I was hoodwinked back then too, and I won't
I don't think anybody was. I mean, were we hoodwinked? Was it a hoodwinking? I mean, a hoodwinking implies that there was somebody deliberately trying to deceive. The one person who was deliberately trying to deceive, it appears now, based on those foreign affairs reviews of all the Iraqi archives, was Saddam himself, right? And Saddam wanted everybody to think he had these programs. Hence, he would have big parades of his nuclear fedayeen, and you know what I'm saying? Yes, we were hood.
I think you're giving a bit too much credit to the Iraqi exiles and to the folks in the Pentagon and the White House. I think there was some deliberate hoodwinking going on there, and look, I fell for it. I believed the intelligence and I believed the administration's case back then.
Well, I mean, I really am going to disagree with you. I actually think that for the most part, the view that Saddam had a nuclear program was not shared, obviously, with Mohammed al-Baradei, but of the International Atomic Energy Agency. But certainly we had reasons to doubt the IAEA's efficacy because prior to the Iraq first Gulf War, they had gotten it wrong. They'd gotten North Korea wrong, and they'd just gotten Iran wrong. They did not warn us of Iran's program. That was sort of found out through. So I'm saying that it's true that there were that it's certainly true that when the intelligence was being assembled for the UN for the UN Security Council, when the intelligence was being assembled, it was in many ways the best case. But I think if you would have read the entire, often had people read the whole NIE, right, including the caveats from the State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research. But I don't think that you would have, if you would have read the whole thing, you would have come away at the time saying Saddam isn't amassing this arsenal. I think you would have said, well, there are some doubts on some specific. I mean, one example is the aluminum tubes. I mean, the Department of Energy dissented. That's true on the aluminum tubes, but they also said that the import of a specialized magnet was for a kind of nuclear program as well. So, yes, there were some dissents within that, but the CIA's main people who were doing weapons of mass destruction analysis believed, the kind of apocalyptic scenario, as did Clinton administration officials like Ken Pollack and others, as well as Sandy Berger and Bill Clinton himself, he even said,
Yeah, and it turns out we were all wrong.
Well, I'm just saying it was if it was a hoodwinking, it was a bipartisan hoodwinking over several years and multiple administrations. How about that?
I think that's
all right.
right.
Well, let's move on.
Yeah, let's talk about some more recent history. You and I both read this article in the latest issue of Military Review about the surge, and not really just the surge, but this idea of an Anbar awakening, and what were the roots behind that, and what gave rise to that. What did you think of that article?
Well, I mean, first of all, kudos to a real hero who maybe people haven't read about, Major Neil Smith and Colonel Sean McFarland. They really walk us through what I think is a great history of Anbar from, I'd say, 2005 to like 2007, where you really understand the context in which this has happened. Like one thing that I think gets missed is that's in this article is that they talk about there had been efforts in the past to have a kind of tribal uprising against Al-Qaeda that had failed. And, it's not like, this was inevitably going to happen if with or without, the extra Marines that went to Anbar, it seems. I think that they were able to really exploit it. I think that it's a great, if you're interested in tactical issues, as I know you are, Phil, it's really an interesting it's almost like a defensive improvisation. Would you agree with that?
No, I absolutely
It's sort of a defense of not having like a plan that, the military is so often will have like a rigid, you do A in this situation and B in that situation. This is all about reacting to events that are really unfolding very quickly, and they did a wonderful job of exploiting it, particularly their I.O. campaign. They realized that the changing political dynamic of the tribal council in Anbar, they saw these openings, and then finally, I mean, it's a lesson in life, not just the military. Follow through on what you promise, which is the most important thing, right?
Yeah, and I mean this is jazz improvisation mixed with counterinsurgency. You're right. They met a situation on the ground they weren't prepared for, and they looked for ideas to solve the problem, and they found the best one, and they ran with it. The interesting thing is this all happened before the surge, long before the surge, and so they were making do before the surge. They were making do without the larger number of troops that they would later have in 2007. This was a diplomatic offensive at the tactical level, and it was initiated by soldiers and Marines, not by diplomats. And I think there are some larger lessons in there, principally that it came about by talking to the people that were ordinarily our enemies. I mean, Sean McFarland and Neil Smith and all the other officers there didn't make this happen by talking with the good guys or by working more with the Army and the police. They found the people that were killing them. And they said, we've got common ground. We both hate Al-Qaeda. Let's sit down. Let's smoke some cigarettes. Let's drink some chai. And let's talk about how we can make things better. And it worked. I also think that I remember, because I was over there in 2006, how desperate things were. There was always sort of a running joke. Which was the worst city, Bakuba, where I was at, or Ramadi, or Fallujah? The three were sort of vying for the worst city in Iraq at this time. And there was a report that came out from the Marines that painted Anbar province in incredibly desperate ways. It just basically said it was lost. And I think it took that kind of desperation to push these officers to find such an unconventional solution. So they wouldn't have found this if they had it been totally written off and then given the freedom to experiment. But it was that desperation that said, hey, we got to try something. Let's talk to our enemies. Let's make something happen. And the long gamble worked, I think.
I would agree with almost everything you said. I mean, the one thing I would say is that I think that this account, which, I think anybody who's serious in journalism wants to sort of cover this and understand this, should read, really doesn't augur well for something. Sometimes you hear a very dismissive criticism from some quarters which says, well, we're just renting these sheikhs. where they're just with us because they were with us because we gave them money. And I think that it shows, no, they're with us in part because we are a much better alternative to Al-Qaeda dominating them. And it certainly meshes with when I was there about a year ago and I talked to some of these tribal sheikhs. The sense that I had was, they wanted jobs for their guys. Of course they did. And that, and I know that counterinsurgency, so much of that is making sure that you find young men and make sure that they don't have a bunch of, large spaces of time on their hand without any money. There's another element of this, which is that while I wouldn't call the Anbar sheikhs liberal Jeffersons, they certainly are a lot better than the alternative had the Islamic State of Iraq been able to actually hold Anbar. And they're certainly a lot better than, the sort of alternative when you kind of had, the Iraqi sheikhs in a kind of almost a vassalitude in some ways. At least that was the end of the end state of the end state of the Al-Qaeda strategy. And there is, I've always thought that there was a huge overall information operation victory in defining that you've got authentic Iraqi Sunni Muslims who are rejecting what they consider to be a foreign invasion of this Salafi-inspired Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And certainly Al-Qaeda in Iraq can't credibly make the claim in Iraq anymore that they are speaking for any large segment of the Iraqi population, and that's in large part due to the bravery of these sheikhs and the improvisation and brilliance of the original Marine officers. The one point I just want to sort of say is that I think that there's a bandwagon effect of the surge, just the increase in Marines at a moment when it was unclear, where I think a lot of sheikhs were, they say, they didn't know whether the Americans would abandon them or not, and that may have actually played a role in them teaming up with the Americans, which is that they thought, well, if we're left here to just Al-Qaeda, that's far worse. But I think when more Americans came to Anbar, it made it safer for more people to sort of join in the revolution. So, yes, it's true that the surge itself didn't create the Anbar awakening, but the surge bolstered and certainly augmented and strengthened that awakening, and I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, and I think you have to look at the timeline, too, and what had been the trend over the last 4 years. The overall pattern had been that we would have a success, and then we would pull back, and then Al-Qaeda would come in and slaughter those people who had worked with us.
Yep.
And what this enabled us to do was to break that pattern and to actually protect the people that had worked with us and sustain the success over time. Counterinsurgency, it's a long-term game. It's not the kind of thing you win and then you declare victory and dance in the end zone. And that's really been a flaw in the United States operational art in Iraq for a while. We did this in Talafar. You saw a brilliant victory achieved there in early 2006, but then we drew down there to a very low troop level, and Al-Qaeda came right back in, and the sectarian violence started anew. And what the surge enabled us to do for the first time was actually sustain these gains over time and sort of consummate them and make them lasting. And so I think that has been the real lesson here. But, one point you talk about, what's the real reason for the success, what's the role of the surge. What I loved about this article was it was so rich and textured. It avoided that debate, and it framed everything as a complex formula. Nothing is singularly to the blame for the success or failure here because Iraq is a complex place. And what I really hate the debate today is that everyone wants to point to one thing and say that's to blame. The surge is to blame for the success, or the surge has failed and therefore we have to pull out. That's wrong. It's just too complex of a place for that. And I think we do the debate and ourselves a great disservice when we sort of reduce everything down to that formula.
If I may, I want to sort of just ask you, sort of one of the things that really comes through in this article is that, and we can debate the merits of America staying in Iraq over a period of time from a sort of strategic perspective, or just from a perspective of making our country secure or making our allies secure. But from a moral perspective of what we want our military to do, I'm not necessarily proud of everything our military did in Iraq. I mean, we all know about Abu Ghraib, which was a reserve unit. But in terms of what these Marines were doing when they finally got this strategy that was winning, and in terms of protecting civilian populations from the likes of Al-Qaeda or in other areas from the likes of the kind of Khomeinist or inspired ethnic cleansers that are affiliated with elements of Sadr's movement. I can't think of fewer kind of from a moral perspective, more better missions. I mean, this is protecting. These are protecting families that are left in Iraq from I think some of the worst barbarians on the planet, and that is something I think that the soldiers who participated in this should be proud of for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I think so. Although the Anbar problem set was a different problem set than the rest of the country.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. I'm not disagreeing with that, but I'm saying the idea that the focus now of the American strategy is protecting civilian populations from those people who are really intent on sabotaging anything that would resemble an Iraqi nation state.
Right.
Now, I don't think that that's quite the same as refereeing a sectarian civil war. If you follow what I'm saying, because keep in mind that we were protecting Sunnis from Sunnis. What?
Yeah, I think that's a distinction without a difference. I mean, if you're talking about protecting the Iraqi people from the agents that are trying to kill them in Anbar, you're talking about protecting them from Al-Qaeda and from other parts of the Sunni insurgency. Yeah. But in Baghdad or the Diyala province, then you really are talking about stepping in the middle of a sectarian war, because that's where the violence is. And that's where you have the sectarian warfare going on. So I don't know that I would make that semantic distinction, but that said, I think protecting the Iraqi people is exactly how you describe it. It's an honorable mission for us. It's a moral mission, and I do feel there's strong moral pull to continue protecting the Iraqi people. It's hard to leave that behind and feel good about that.
Well, let's improvise right now. I mean, as I see it, I'm not with the I think the majority of my colleagues, journalists. That's just to say, there's no really good end game in this. I think that at the very least, we should have enough of a force presence in Iraq so that the federal elections scheduled for the end of 2009 go off. Because there is a possibility, and I think we'll see in the provincial elections, that you will get rid of the no good Sunni parties, which I think we can talk about the Sunni parties that ended up basically claiming credit for winning an election in a lot of places where they didn't. But I think you can also see the beginning of the electoral political process potentially reforming the Shia coalition in Baghdad, if not replacing them with newer parties or better parties that could reconcile, which is to say that people talk about political reconciliation, and I think that elections are a huge part of that. Yeah. So for you don't think so?
I think you're being a bit optimistic about what's going to happen in these provincial elections and what's going to happen in the federal elections. Look, the Iraqi political landscape has been decimated. The good political leaders are no longer really playing in the process. The presidential candidate that I like the most has said he's not going to get back in. That's Ayad Alawi, who is head of Iraq, the secular Shiite who's head of Iraq in 2005. I really don't have a lot of hope for the Maliki government or for whatever will take its place. I actually think that the most important thing about these provincial elections is to bring the Sunnis back in, not to get rid of the Sunni parties, but to get them into the process. And
you mean the Tawafuk parties? You mean like Tawafuk and these guys?
The Sunnis that sat out in 2005 and that really have been disenfranchised ever since. They've got to get back in the process.
I think in that respect, yes, but let me augment that a little bit. I think that there are Sunni parties in Baghdad, and at least those that sort of are under the kind of Sunni Islamist banner, in my opinion, are really just kind of front men for terrorist criminals. Those people should probably lose. At least they're expected to lose. And if they're replaced by parties that are tied to the Sunni tribal networks, which were in 2005, as you pointed out, were boycotting the elections, or at least we're sort of aligned with Al-Qaeda. If they are represented, then I think, yes, that's good for reconciliation, and I would agree with you. But there is a Sunni parties right now in Baghdad, and they're worthless. I think it's a huge intelligence failure that we courted them in Cairo and Amman and Damascus, and we asked them, please, say you're representing the Sunnis. They didn't represent anyone, and they were also, I think, committed more to the sabotage of Iraq than to its reconciliation.
Yeah, so let's shift gears. Let's talk about the Shiites for a minute. What do you think is going on in Sadr City right now, and what's Maliki's next play?
Well, we saw over the weekend. Did you see this? That Muqtada Sadr once again threatened to, light this country on fire and so forth.
Yeah, and Condi Rice basically said, "Hey, bring it on." What's going on?
Well, I mean, I don't want to. Listen, I think in 2005, certainly in 2004, when Sadr was in Najaf in the bunker. And he had a lot of credibility, and he also spoke for a lot of Shiites who were not getting government services, who were at constant fear of being terrorized by Al Qaeda and Baathists, and certainly he had an appeal in 2004 and 2005. Anybody who reads Anthony Shadid's excellent book can certainly see that. I don't know that Sadr has that same kind of nationalist appeal throughout Iraq. I think he certainly has a lot of power and sway and influence in Sadr City, which is a huge ghetto. I mean, it's almost, I think if you, population-wise, it would be the third largest or second largest city in Iraq.
Yeah.
But I don't think it benefits him. I don't think he came out looking particularly good after the battles for Basra. I don't think, him being in Qom as he's, employing or exhorting his people to fight gives, credits him as a nationalist figure. And, we hear a lot from Sadr and a lot of threats from Sadr, but we've really seen very little follow-through. He made a list of demands, if you remember, that ended up not being a condition for him calling his men off the street. Mm-hmm. And he hasn't gotten, obviously, any of them. Remember when he said, okay, I'm calling my men, but I'm making a list of demands. We want to bring refugees back. We want to stop the arrests. The arrests have continued. And, I think you have varying reports, but the Iraqi army at least says they control the port of Basra now. So, I don't know. I mean, Sadr, I think, is not quite the nationalist figure that he was before, and it doesn't help that he's in Iran right now while his men are fighting in Iraq.
I think that's right, but it's hard to see what the Maliki government's really going to do. I mean, we've put these walls up, and that's previously been a precursor to military action. It's also been a very valuable tool for sort of segmenting communities and preventing violence from moving. Yep. So it's not clear what's going to happen in Sadr City, and I worry about the Iraqi government's ability to do what it wants to do there. They didn't make a good showing in Basra, and that was a very small engagement compared to what would happen in Sadr City. This is a city of 1 million or so people crammed into a 3-mile by 2-mile grid of tenements and slums and canals and alleys, and it is an urban combat nightmare. And I don't even think the American forces in Iraq have the wherewithal to go in there and clean it out, let alone the Iraqi forces. And so I worry that Maliki may be really biting off more than he can chew. But I also have to applaud him for finally taking on these Shia militias. It's just going to be one of those things that I think we need to watch really closely.
I agree. The one thing I would say is that if the pattern continues, we might find that Sadr is, he talks big, but he carries a little stick, to invert the TR phrasing. If I'm just saying that there's a pattern, I don't know if I picked it up, that Sadr has been threatening for the last 6 months, all kinds of crazy things. Remember the 1 million man march that was going to be in Najaf, that was going to be in Baghdad? That didn't go off. So there might be something here where Sadr this might be something that we're intricately missing, but that maybe what we're seeing is a sort of face-saving way for possibly what the ideally would be was you just isolated, which is what we thought we had before, the really violent Sadrist elements from the rest of the movement, and the movement can then come back into the political system, and then, obviously this time, please don't, turn don't use the health service to further your ethnic cleansing.
Right.
But I don't necessarily. I think that if you can get them to sort of agree to a political accord in some way, that also commits them to renouncing violence and ending that violence. That would be a big win, and maybe this is part of a kind of face-saving ritual. But we have seen a lot of threats from Sadr, and he hasn't really followed through. So I hope.
Yeah, although I worry, if the Maliki government doesn't follow through on its strategy here, if they fall flat on their face, then Sadr's going to come away from this looking like a big hero. as he did after 2004. And so then he'll be that much harder to take down, that much harder to bring into the political process. And I think that we'll have a real difficult problem on our hands. So I
don't know, but is he going to look like a hero from Qom? He's obviously, I mean, there's an implicit thing here, which is that if he had his druthers, I'm sure he'd want to study to be an Ayatollah in Najaf, which is where his family has historically studied, and also has more prestige if you're an Iraqi politician. Mm-hmm. So, yes, he did have more prestige in 2000. I think it was in part because, he was like Tupac. Like, they tried to kill him, but he was still there. But now, I don't know, he's more like MC Shans. You know what I'm saying? He's a hip-hop reference. Okay. MC Shans, for those readers who don't follow hip-hop as much as I do, was the rapper that KRS-One originally called out. And we haven't heard from him, and KRS-One is this big legend now. Anyway, moving on, hip-hop and Muqtada Sadr. Let's talk about the campaigns.
Yes.
And we should full disclose here, right?
We should disclose that I've been a volunteer advisor to the Obama campaign, although I don't speak for the campaign in any way or have any inside information about the campaign.
And I should disclose that I'm an Alan Keyes man. No, I'm kidding. Anyway. Do you remember Alan Keyes?
I do remember Alan Keyes.
Alan Keyes actually ran against Obama in his U.S. Senate run in 2006. Okay, so let's talk about the Democrats and what they're going to end up, you think, doing in Iraq. And I've been writing about this. Maybe you should start talking. You should go first as just Phil Carter, national security writer, former Army captain, blogger extraordinaire.
Yeah, I do think there's, and this has historically been true for all national security issues, there's a big change that happens on Inauguration Day, and when you inherit the problems of state, you inherit the mantle of leadership, you see problems differently. So I do think there's going to be movement, whoever's elected, whether it's Senator McCain, Senator Obama, or Senator Clinton, and that's going to be something we see in January 2009. That said, the Democrats in particular have a challenge because they've made redeployment from Iraq a strategic plank. It is the centerpiece of the national security strategy. And I agree with that. I think we have to redeploy. That's in our strategic interest. But the challenge is, how do you get out more responsibly than you got in? That is a Herculean challenge. And I think the granularity on that plan is something that can only emerge as we get closer to it in time. Right now, it's just very difficult to see what the situation is going to be in 6 months to a year. And so the best that we can do is to make sort of grand pronouncements of strategy and then to say we will work through those down the road.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
What does a Democratic candidate or a Democratic president say when or if you see Prime Minister Maliki, President Talabani publicly say we would like to reduce the size of Americans' presence in Iraq, but we're pleading with you, please don't leave. We would very much like a residual force here, if only just as a to make sure that we continue with this the progress we've seen in the last year in rooting out this insurgency, which is killing our people.
Yeah, I think that's increasingly likely, and that's part of the negotiation of state that takes place once you're the person in the Oval Office. You said something that I want to key in on, and that's what happens when the Iraqis start to assert their own interests. I think the Iraqis have very important interests, but we can't make our decision in Iraq based on their interests alone. We have to consider our interests. And our interest in the global war on terrorism is not to be in Iraq longer than we have to, and not to be in Iraq longer than our interests dictate. Our real interests are in Afghanistan. Our real interests are opposing Al-Qaeda 2.0 and 3.0, wherever it may be. You've written about this, and I've written about this. They're in South America. They're in the Philippines. They're in East Africa. And if the mission in Iraq impedes our efforts there, then I think we really have a stronger argument for American interests that says we need to come home, or we need to bring U.S. troops out of Iraq so they can focus on those other places.
All right. Well, let me ask it another way. I think I agree. I certainly agree with you that it's not in our interest for our overall posture in the global war to have 160,000 troops in Iraq, certainly indefinitely, and we want to reduce that size. I think that's right. But would you be against having 50,000 troops in Iraq, 60,000, 70,000? I mean, I don't know the numbers can vary depending on what military expert you talk about. But if there was a presence there, and certainly if you thought that smaller footprint would help bolster and keep Iraq going in a better direction so it doesn't turn into a vassal state, say, of Iran, it doesn't turn into Lebanon of the 1980s,
right.
And that those strike me as absolutely aligned with our interest in the war.
Yeah, and again, speaking for myself, I mean, I've been an advocate for the advisor model for quite some time. This idea that you could have a sustainable force in Iraq of maybe half the size you have now, built around the advisor teams that we have embedded in the Army and the police and the local governance institutions, and that is the mission for the U.S., not so much to engage in direct combat, but to conduct counterinsurgency by, with, and through our Iraqi partners. But I think that model has some really severe shortcomings, too. I think that it's very difficult to sustain and secure advisor teams that are out there. And I've been one of those guys, so I really understand the issues here at a grassroots level. I also think that we lose a lot of our ability to influence events on the ground when we withdraw combat forces. That is, that the local brigade nearby is the big stick that the advisor has in his back pocket. And without that, he might not be as effective. And the same could be said of the ambassador, that the only reason he has as much control as he has is that there are 150,000 U.S. troops there. And I also think
I think that you can retain some influence, you would agree, if you had the night watch function, as they talk about it. It's a technical term, but basically quick reaction forces that were strategically stationed, that were not there to be in constant sort of patrols and so forth. Eventually, you turn over the mission of protecting civilian populations to an Iraqi security force as it matures. But if you had a kind of presence there in the end, then you can. It's an insurance against it's an insurance against sort of fallback on it's an insurance against disasters in a way, right?
Yeah,
and it's also it gives you a presence if Al Qaeda crops back up, or if you have something on the Shia side similar to that.
But this is a bit of a fantasy. I mean, you really have to think through the nuts and bolts here. If you're talking quick response forces, what's your trigger for their deployment? How do they move around the country? If they're deploying by helicopters, that's a hell of a support tail to bring with them. And then they can only move so many kilometers, so you really have to scatter them around the country. You have the risk of a Srebrenica problem, which is the city in Bosnia where Dutch peacekeepers stood by and watched Bosnians slaughtered because they didn't have the forces to do anything and didn't have the rules of engagement that let them do anything. And that's a very real risk if you have too few troops in Iraq or you have too restrictive of a rules of engagement document. We've been down this road before. In 2005 and 2006, we drew down to about 130,000 troops in country. We spread the butter very thinly across Iraq. We had small garrisons that were consolidating into larger bases and trying to do this. And that was when we saw the worst sectarian violence in Iraq's history. With the Samarra mosque bombing and then the explosion of sectarian violence. But
hold on. I'm glad you brought that up, though, right? You're right. In 2005, we saw the worst. And 2006, we saw the worst. And in part, I think it was because you would agree that Al Qaeda is a shadow of what it was then. And I would hope you would agree that while I have a lot of criticisms of the Shia-led government, it's certainly different now that they're willing to take on Iranian-backed and Sadrist militias than they were when they wouldn't touch them. And in fact, indeed, these elements were part of the government itself and exacerbated the problem, right?
But Al-Qaeda's never been the chief cause of conflict. It's been a catalyst and it's been an accelerant. But the real engines of conflict have been the Sunni insurgency and the Shiite militias. And those are
but the
actually
Askari
better
Mosque
trained.
was Al-Qaeda.
They're better trained and equipped now because of our initiatives to create these local militia and security groups, that concern local citizens, the Sons of Iraq. Yeah. If we pull out or if we draw down and these folks want to start fighting again, they're in a better position to do so today than they were 2 years ago. And that's because we've given them the weapons and the money to do so. So I think that we can't minimize the risk here and we can't focus too much on Al-Qaeda. the powder keg is still very much in place over there.
I agree that powder keg is there, but I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic that this concerned local citizens will not end up choosing to sort of fight the Shia government, in part because the Shia government has self-reformed. I think that they get a lot of political benefit by doing what they did in Basra, by starting or at least planning for what appears to be operations maybe in Sadr city, and at least sort of taking a zero-tolerance line with the rejectionist side of the Shia militias. And I also think that they, to a certain extent, represent a completely different kind of leadership than the Sunni insurgency of 2005, whereas the tribes were allowing and in the background and maybe profiting as smugglers and bandits while, sadistic elements kind of did their work. They've turned on those lethal accelerants, which Qaeda, of course, did claim credit for the Asqariya mosque bombing. And in this respect, at least so far so good. I don't think that they're threatening to, or that they at least so far so good. They don't seem to be at this point ready to sort of march into Baghdad and restart this sort of sectarian war. Now, that's predicting the future, so I can't, say for sure. But I'm more optimistic, I think, on that respect than you are.
Yeah, I think you are.
And ironically, from a humanitarian perspective, my position of being more optimistic about the CLCs would lead me to endorse, ultimately, the preparations for a smaller footprint, right?
Yeah, I think so, because you think that that these folks can keep the peace. It's funny. I was on TV with a guy named Stephen Biddle about a year ago, and he's this brilliant PhD who's now at the Council on Foreign Relations. He'd been over in Iraq as part of Petraeus' planning team. And he made a very interesting point. He said, there's two ways you can have security in Iraq. One, you can put an American or an Iraqi soldier on every street corner. Two, you can have these bilateral political deals, these agreements with the Sunnis and with the Shiites and with the Kurds to take their people off the street and to be peaceful. And he said that there's no way we'll ever muster enough troops to secure Iraq, and we shouldn't even hold out hope for that. But if you can get these political deals and you can sustain them, then there is hope. And so I think
I don't think that the tribal leadership of most of the Sunni regions of Iraq are irredentist or crazy. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're fanatics. Whereas I do think that there was an effort, and to a degree we saw that while you're right, al-Qaeda was an accelerant, not the main cause, the Islamic State of Iraq was, in some ways, an effort to exert a kind of overall control of the broader Sunni insurgency. And we saw, they offered deals to these other groups like the 1923 Brigade and so forth. They said, listen, either join us or we'll kill you. Mm-hmm. And this was like kind of the big mafia coming in and swallowing up the smaller mafias. So while not everybody who was a foot soldier was, kind of al-Qaeda, formally, at the top of that organization in 2006 and 2005 were foreigners who were al-Qaeda, who were basically there on behalf of Osama bin Laden.
Yeah. Well, let's change gears a little bit. Let's talk about al-Qaeda generally outside of Iraq. What do you think is going on with them, and where are they at today, and why haven't we heard much from them?
Can you say it again?
Where is al-Qaeda today, and why hasn't the United States really heard much from them?
Well, I don't know. The Zawahiri puts out a tape every couple months, and bin Laden, I remember 6 months ago, had a series that he put out on the Al Sahab network.
They should be on Blogging Heads.
He should be on Blogging Heads. Right. It's interesting because right now, I would say that al-Qaeda, sort of what I guess you would call al-Qaeda senior leadership, which is primarily, though not exclusively, in the Fatah regions of Pakistan, is focusing on Pakistani politics. Mm-hmm. We have heard a lot from them in the sense that they killed Benazir Bhutto, that they have won, or at least rebuffed, a counterinsurgency from the Pakistani military. And I think that I remember having a conversation 6 months ago, I think, with Spencer Ackerman, where we were both sort of asking ourselves, was the main front for al-Qaeda Central never really Iraq, but maybe it was Pakistan? And I think in Pakistan, that is where they're going to go, and that's a conundrum. What does a policymaker do there?
Right.
I mean, you can't invade Pakistan, and it seems that, at least for now, if there was a chance for an awakening model, which we don't know that there is, but if there was, then you are now in the doldrums of 2005, where anybody who ever even gave a whisper of wanting to cooperate with the Pakistani government or NATO forces or something like that has been killed. So they really have, they've definitely set up shop and taken over. But I think that's why we haven't heard as much from them, because they're focusing on trying to take over Pakistan.
Yeah, and I also agree with the folks like Peter Bergen and others that have said it's really evolved into this franchise chain, and they've decentralized their operations to the point where the team in Afghanistan isn't really directing operations against the United States anymore. They're just inspiring them through these videotapes and through other means. And so my attention's really been focused on their activities through Jamaat Islamiyah in the Philippines and the tri-border area of South America, where Paraguay and Uruguay and other countries come together. I mean, that's the front we need to worry about. And I think that we need to be on guard this year. Al-Qaeda has a history of doing things that play to the American electorate and play to the American elections. They clearly have a lot at stake. And we need to really be careful about what's going to come down the pike towards us. I don't think we can take our eye off this ball at all. But your point about
can I ask you like a big thing question, Phil?
Go for it.
It's a big thing question. Okay, it's a defense posture question. Okay, and it kind of goes back to what Stephen Biddle was saying, and it kind of goes back to what you're saying now, which is that we got to worry about these kind of like local insurgencies that Al Qaeda influenced, Al Qaeda supported, and share in general kind of Al Qaeda Salafi vision, right?
Right.
Does this augur for America's defense posture to be essentially a version of the Reagan doctrine, which was after Vietnam, conservatives and Ronald Reagan realized that he wanted to challenge the Soviets, but he did not want to commit the U.S. military to any sort of long, drawn-out conflict. And instead what he did is he supported proxies and pro-American and pro-Western kind of militias and outfits, from the Contras to Jonas Savimbi in Angola, to, of course, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and so forth. And is the future, in some ways, not an army of counterinsurgency experts that is much larger with lots of reconstruction building, but rather an army of, special operators in black pajamas that are very good at creating kind of local and homegrown insurgencies within areas that sort of geographic regions where Salafists have taken control.
Yeah.
Or
aligning
with other governments, basically, to put down Salafi insurgencies, on the edges of the Islamic world.
Well, I certainly wouldn't focus on just the Salafist insurgencies. Yeah. I would focus on other emerging threats and conflicts. I mean, everything from the food riots in Haiti worry me a great deal, partly because they're so close to our border.
You mean the food riots in Egypt? Yeah.
Yeah.
They were, yeah. I lived in Egypt for a year, so, yeah.
I think that advisory operations are a classic special forces mission, but they can be done by more than just special forces. And I think that the ability to act by, with, and through local partners is going to be part of our global posture for a long time. We have to have the ability to project into these countries where these emerging threats emerge and to bolster and strengthen local institutions. But it's got to be more than just military assistance. And I think this is the shortcoming in the Reagan doctrine, and this is where some of the leading minds in counterinsurgency, like John Nagel and Dave Kilcullen, really get it right. It's got to be sort of holistic national assistance that includes humanitarian, governance, economic aid. We've got to really focus on taking failed states and turning them around and making them the kinds of places that deny sanctuary to emerging threats and emerging terrorist actors, not that provide sanctuary. And that is absolutely going to be the major mission for the American military in the first half of the 21st century. And what worries me is that our military is still largely organized for conventional combat. We have not moved in this direction very much, and there's no signs on the horizon that we're moving in this direction. And, I'm sort of an unrepentant counterinsurgent. I've always liked the small wars. It's why I became an MP and a civil affairs captain and not an infantry officer, because I think that's where the real mission is. But it's not where the military is today. And every time you read a story about a new procurement or, a new doctrinal manual, you sort of have to scratch your head and say, is this really going to help us fight these future wars, or is this going to help us fight the kind of war we want to fight?
Yeah, no. That's you hit the nail on the head. I think that all that's right in working with the local partners. Now, the one caveat I would make, however, is that there are certain kind of local partners, like, I would argue the Egyptian government, that are very corrupt and in some ways provide, through their own arbitrary cruelty towards the population, a kind of constant driver of jihadism. Does that make sense? So we have to be careful about our local partners, and it's a really delicate balancing act. And I have to say that the frontline son of SINC commanders and the colonels under them and the people who are doing this kind of everyday diplomacy that is part of our global counterinsurgency that we do right now, these people are not going to ever fit into an ideological basket. They've got to make decisions based on kind of competing, goods and liabilities, benefits and liabilities, and it's never going to be necessarily neat. It's always going to be fairly messy, but at the same time, that's probably the way that we've got to go.
Well, and this is the lesson from Anbar, too, that can be applied to Egypt. If you want to make progress, sometimes you have to work with dirty people. But, at the same time, you can't just turn
always
a blind
be aware,
eye.
Right.
You can't turn a blind eye to what Egypt is doing in its prisons and its torture regime. I mean, over the long haul, you have to try to reform that. But in the short term, you still have to work with them because they're the allies you've got, and they're the ones that are doing the most right now to oppose terrorism inside Egypt, even as their policies are sort of helping to create it in the long run.
Well, yes, you have to work with who you've got, but there's got to be some way to sort of acknowledge. I mean, like to a certain extent, when you get to the question of Saudi Arabia, depends on what segment of that, kind of royal family you're working with, right? I mean, it's part of that royal family I would consider to be basically on the enemy's side. You know what I'm saying? That, yes, it's true that you have to be careful who you're working with, but you should always be very cognizant of that. And if you have a government that is funding startup madrasas that are indoctrinating kids to ultimately become jihadist insurgents, you got to deal with that too.
Yeah, but where's our counter to that? I mean, where's the U.S. Information Agency? Where's the USAID building madrasas abroad? We have totally ceded the field of battle to the enemy in the war of ideas, and we ought to be pouring billions and billions of dollars into this effort, but we're not. Hold
on, Phil. It's interesting. I agree with you. Someone needs to do it. I don't think the U.S. government should do it because the U.S. government doesn't have the credibility. By the way, I don't think they had the credibility to do it before 9/11 either. But I think that's a great job. I say this as a kind of, a free market conservative. That's a great thing. You can have tax incentives for people to start these kinds of NGOs that are similar to what Soros did in the former Soviet Union to create alternatives to these madrasas that don't have a flag on it. You know what I'm saying? Like it shouldn't. That you need to make sure that it's not a national project because once you associate that with the United States, even if you can argue well enough saying, well, we're not really an empire, it doesn't matter because it's a losing idea battle. Instead, have it come from some sort of international organization that is there to. I believe that this is ultimately the path towards the self-emancipation of the Muslim and Arab world. But, I mean, it cannot be something that's done with the American taxpayer dollars.
It's funny. I had a very close friend and advisor in Iraq. He was my interpreter. He was a former law professor. And I asked him what was the legal document or the principle that he thought that we should be most proud of. And he always came back to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He said Eleanor Roosevelt was his hero. And he wishes that we would rely on that document more because everyone in the Middle East believed in it. And I thought that was very interesting because he was able to tie that document and the sort of broader conception of human rights to a number of different strands in Islam. And I think that there may be common ground there that NGOs and others can exploit. But you're right. The U.S. government probably doesn't have the credibility to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, listen, we have to do this because tomorrow Pennsylvanians vote. And this may be the determining election. So we just have to, as blogging heads people, we have to sort of say what our predictions are and maybe give a brief explanation of how things are going to go. So you want to go first on that?
No, I'll defer to you.
All right. Let me give you the Eli Lake theory as just someone who's observed this. I think Hillary is not going to win by a significant margin and may actually lose. And the reason I think this is because she has, for Pennsylvania, just as in part she has for Texas, relied upon the people that she once identified as the right-wing conspiracy to tear her down to ultimately augment votes in a Democratic primary. And I would argue that this is the equivalent of running for the Prime Minister of Israel with an endorsement from Hassan Nasrallah. So Hillary Clinton's strategy of getting Richard Mellon Scaife's paper to endorse her and having Rush Limbaugh's Operation Chaos convince Republicans to register as Democrats before the deadline and vote for her, I think in the end will ultimately convince most Democrats that Obama is the authentic candidate of their party.
I agree with the prediction for the outcome in Pennsylvania. I think Obama will secure the nomination in the long run, and that the Clinton campaign's tactics are not going to work because overall his strategy has been better, his vision has been better, and that it's really going to all come together after this when people see where the chips fall after the primaries are over and decide that he's the candidate with the best shot.
Now, let me ask you this, and maybe you can't answer it because you volunteer your sage advice to that campaign, but do you think when Obama gets the nomination that he will emphasize his line about, well, we have to get out far more carefully, as carefully as we got in, as carelessly as we got in, right? I mean, that's sort of, I think I mangled that phrase, but that's sort of what he's saying. Will he emphasize his flexibility and his sense that he's not going to just totally bug out of Iraq 16 months, 2 brigades a month? Or will he run in the general as the candidate who will end the war?
I think he's going to run as the candidate who's had the right judgment on the war since the start. And that judgment connotes making the right decision once he's in the Oval Office, too.
Oh, okay, but that's, all right. See, that's a little bit of a dodge. I want to know if he's going to continue to say 2 brigades a month, it's coming out. You know what I'm saying? I'm curious if he's going to go down that road or if he's going to emphasize, like, listen, this is a hard situation. But trust me, I have the right judgment. I was right in 2002, and I'll be right now, and you got to go with me. I think I don't know.
I don't know, and I wouldn't deign to speak for the campaign, but I think it's going to boil down to judgment, and I think that's the argument that's going to be made.
Okay, I think Hassan Nasrallah is endorsing Hillary Clinton. That's a joke. All right. Great dialogue, Phil Carter. I really enjoyed this, and I hope the viewers did too.
Thank you, Eli. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too. Okay.